Misha here, and last time we left off with clones, we've already been through Phase 1 armor, Phase 2, and its specialties and updates. But what if you have troops that really need something completely different? So today we talk about what was a parallel but separate cloning process and equipment design program for the so-called clone commandos. In fact, whereas your standard clone trooper would have a name and number CT1234, these guys would actually be RC for Republic Commando 1234. Although, of course, we're looking at Delta Squad, so we have RC 1138, RC 1140, and RC 1207, and RC1262. And we will see some elements of the commandos eventually kind of creep in to the regular Grand Army of the Republic, but other elements will just kind of stay unique to these guys. And all four are on the table because from the very beginning, they were trained in groups of 4 to work in a small team known as a pod. And the idea for a commando unit came from Jango Fett and other Mandalorians helping out the Commandoans to do espionage, sabotage, assassin missions, covert reconnaissance missions, just things that the regular Grand Army of the Republic clone troopers could not really do because they were trained to be loyal to the Republic but also work in large groups of hundreds or thousands. All that said, all the clones were elites because, with just a couple of million made, it wasn't enough for the entire galaxy, but they were the shock troops. But these were meant to be the elite of the elite, but also to kind of work apart. In fact, when they tried to integrate these directly with the main army, the results were not all that good. And this is also where we start to see kind of customization and uniqueness creep into the clones, because while they would use their numbers, each of these had a name that they would adopt from the beginning. Boss, Fixer, Sev, and everyone's favorite, Scorch. So let's begin with the leader, because he's kind of your standard, all-purpose, well-rounded commando. Boss here was a clone sergeant and leader of his pod, and from birth they trained together as a unit. And while they would receive standard flash style training and simulation training like a regular clone, they would actually get a lot more live fire training from a much younger age than a standard clone. Now they're based on the Jango template, and while they did leave a little more independence and creative thinking than on a standard clone, they were still given the absolute loyalty factor, and they eliminated some of Jango Fett's loner tendencies, at least enough so that they could work in a small group. So instead of being just a loner or being loyal to the entire army, they were kind of in the middle. They were loyal to the Republic, but also, and more importantly, to each other. They really relied on their group think. And each one had a specialty, with Boss being the central hub, the coordinator, also just one of the main guns. He was also said to be of the group most like Jango Fett. And they were trained by the Cavadar, which were 100 mercenaries, mostly picked by Jango, hired by the Commandoans to live on the planet for 8-10 years and train these. And each one was given 104 commandos under their direct supervision and command. Of the 100 members, 75 are Mandalorians, so a lot of Mandalorian traditions, values, even naming and somewhat dress style would creep in. The other 25 were just smugglers, mercenaries. Most of those would end up being from Corellia or similar, just whatever, and they would have their own thing. So there is some variety in the commandos already, but all were trained for special forces. That's just what's important. And so 100 times 104 meant the original batch of commandos was 10,400. Although several would die during training. Training was very harsh, brutal. Corporal punishment was given, but it was done to toughen them up so they could go behind enemy lines, operate disconnected from supply, think independently, because a lot of times they'd be sent on missions with very little intelligence, so they'd have to innovate. And if they were captured, they could not give away secrets. So that was the dealio. These are older clones, and obviously with the numbers you see with 1138 here, they were among the earlier RCs. And they would paint their armor, although Boss here was considered to be pretty stoic and serious. Didn't do a whole lot of talking. And he is sporting their main weapon we'll talk about more later, but this is the Blastech DC-17M. It was made for the Commandos specifically, and this would have been one of the earliest carbine-sized guns used by the Grand Army of the Republic. I mean, it's much smaller, more compact than the DC-15A, although it actually weighs more, but that's including the entire kit. They would also sometimes carry pistols. He has a DC-17. Early on, they would have the DC-15 pistol. And he's sporting his standard armor here, known as Katarn armor. Yeah, this isn't Phase 1 or Phase 2, although it's at least kind of based on it, and it was designed by the Kaminoans, but it's even more directly influenced by Mandalorian traditions. In fact, some consider this to be about as good of mass-produced armor out there, only kind of inferior to Mandalorian Beskar armor. So let's talk about that. And moving on to Fixer here. He was Delta Squad's corporal, second in command, and he was also relatively quiet and stoic and mature. He acted as kind of the big brother to the group. If Boss was the parental figure, he was the elder brother figure. But the only time he cut loose is when you let him around computers and technology. Then he'd get a little frisky. And he's mostly wearing the same kit, including the DC-17M as Boss. But you'll notice the helmet's slightly altered and the backpack has additions. The Katarn armor had 20 plates, just like the standard Phase 1 and 2, but it was designed to be more flexible, durable, and just better. The body glove, the flight suit underneath, was still sealed against vacuum, heat, cold, but it was a tougher material, because whereas a regular clone could, check back in after a battle, maybe get replacements or repairs, clones maybe not. So the suit underneath is already more durable. The plates on top are a little bit lighter. We talked about how Phase 1 armor was kind of heavy and stiff. Well, they tried their best to make this lighter by doing more of a layered composite material. But at the same time, they actually were able to make the plates able to take a direct hit or more of a glancing blow. So it was tougher armor than even Phase 1, which itself was a little tougher than Phase 2. Yet it had better mobility than Phase 1, more like Phase 2. Now it did end up weighing about as much as Phase 1, but you get a lot more for the weight, and it didn't restrict movement. And obviously things like the shoulder pads are thicker, heavier. It was just all around better kit. And it did feature more VAM braces like a Mandalorian, including retractable wrist blades. And the helmet itself was a pretty special piece of kit and would presumably influence Phase 2 here. It has advanced filtration systems, like the Phase 2 would later. It has a heads-up display, like we would see in the others, but it's much more advanced. It has better tactical awareness of your squad mates. And whereas the Phase 1 and Phase 2 armor could interface with standard GAR weapons, the Katarn helmet, while it definitely interfaced best with the DC-17 and others, it could actually calibrate itself to work with many alien foreign weapons, because a commando may be expected to, want to, have to pick up something behind enemy lines. So at least it had a chance of producing a targeting reticle and all that stuff. It also was much stronger. It could take much more of a hit than the standard helmet. You could attach gadgets on the outside, like we see here, an antenna, although it usually still had an internal compact comms array, again later carried over to phase 2. And then behind we have just a backpack that does everything. It's essentially a survival backpack. It carried food, water, medicine, carried repelling gear, comms array if needed. It carried one oxygen tank as standard for vacuum or underwater, and even a secondary tank could be installed. And then typically it would have some grenades, extra ammunition for the DC-17M or whatever else, and then each specialist could customize it. Fixer here would put electronic gear. That was his job, was the slicer, the computer guy, the tech guy, but he definitely still used his blaster too. But the backpack was very versatile. Yes, it added some weight and bulk, but it meant that these guys could be in the field for a couple of weeks without resupply and still be A-OK. Let's move on to Sev. His nickname is pretty evident, with RC-1207 being his name. So we can talk about the DC-17M itself and why the kit actually weighed more than the DC-15A. Because it was a convertible weapon. The versions carried by Boss and Fixer are just the standard blaster carbine. Keep in mind the DC-15S wasn't out because these guys were trained before the Clone Wars even kicked off. So the standard carbine version had about a 60-shot magazine, relatively powerful bolts, and unlike the DC-15A, it could actually do rapid fire, although range was a little bit sacrificed. And they would typically carry 5 magazine clips, energy clips for these, meaning 300 shots standard, although additional could be carried in the backpack if needed. And yeah, it was just kind of your machine carbine version. One of the attachments, updates that could be done, was turning it into a designated marksman carbine, sniper rifle, if you will. And basically for that, you would swap out the barrel assembly for a somewhat longer one, and you would also swap the magazine, whereas the standard version just fired energy bolts, ion-based energy bolts. This actually had a magazine that fired energy and physical bolt combinations for the range, and it only held 5 per magazine, although you could swap them out. But the energy and physical combination gave it better range, penetration. It was good out to 1,000 meters, easy enough. And you'll notice there's not really much of a scope on it or a shoulder stock. That's because the heads-up display in the Katarn helmet could do up to 20 times magnification, although I don't think they would use that too frequently. So Sev here would typically be the long range, the marksman, the assassin of the group, and while he was a little more jovial than his superiors, he was also pretty ruthless. He was one of the most aggressive fighters in Delta, but he also kind of portrayed his being younger. Otherwise, he's pretty standard to Boss's configuration. But we have one more primary mode for the weapon. And for that, we need our final member here, Scorch. This was the explosives guy, the demolitions guy. He also could disarm bombs, I guess, if he really had to, but he preferred the other direction. And in addition to carrying grenades and satchel charges and the like, he often preferred his DC-17M with the explosives grenade launching RPG configuration. Essentially, he had single shot canister attachments, and they would be made in several different versions: bunker busting, high explosive, armor piercing. Later on, breaching versions would be introduced by Misha during the war, so on and so forth, whatever. And typically on a ready load you would have 3 or 4. One on the gun. He has a couple more on his hip. And his backpack could be carrying extras as much as he wanted. Again, flexible backpack. So he would, well, make things go boom. Kind of self-explanatory. Take out armor, get into an installation, what have you, and it gives you more flexibility with this weapon. While the DC-17M didn't start off with a very effective stun mode, they would add a stun option about a year into the Clone Wars as well, just to give more versatility. Considering the missions that clones would often go on, they weren't really expected to need stun, and the weapon's already doing enough. But yeah, you see why it weighs so much as a kit, because it's kind of 3-4 weapons in one. So individually, it doesn't quite weigh as much, but the idea was, well, they don't know what they need to take into combat, so, well, give them something that they can set up, and each member kind of specialize in one version. They could be easily swapped in the field in just a matter of minutes, with the only real downside, yeah, being the extra weight. And these guys were packing some weight with the backpack, but they were clone commandos. They were strong. They were trained for it. Their training was very brutal but effective, and they were ready to go for the first battle of Geonosis. They were a little early for it, but they were ready. And so 10,000 would be sent in, give or take, in 22 BBY. And some, like Delta, that were used as intended, as small mobile squads working together independently, did well. Unfortunately, the Grand Army of the Republic was very young. The Jedi generals didn't know what the hell they were doing, and so they tried deploying some of the clones as just essentially standard ground troops, and this actually led to thousands being killed. In fact, almost 5,000 commandos died at the first battle of Geonosis, essentially halving the number of commandos as the war would go on. And this would mean that Delta Squadron would actually be pulled back for a bit to reassess what went wrong and what went right. So it wouldn't actually be until around 21 BBY that they figured out how to effectively deploy clone commando pods. But once they did, they were very effective. They would often operate directly under a high-ranking general, or up with a political figure or the Jedi Council. They didn't go through the standard chain of command. So even though Boss was just a sergeant, he might answer to a high counselor on the Jedi Council, and they would continue to serve. But their numbers were obviously depleted. So while the commandos started off with some unique traits, names marking their uniforms and everything, they still had that certain kind of spit and polish standardization, and they were all trained by either a Mandalorian or equivalent, and it gave a certain conformity in their independence. But as the war would go on, and as more commandos were needed, things got a little more diverse and interesting. So let's move the original, highly planned, highly trained, highly structured Republic Commando pod to the side and talk about wartime innovation and, frankly, desperation with the second most famous clone commando pod, the Bad Batch here. And these guys would form late in the Clone Wars, a little out of innovation and a little bit out of necessity. And they would actually start off as CT troopers, but due to experimentation or, frankly, genetic accident, they'd be different. Now, this always happened. Even the Kaminoans were very good cloners. 3-4% of clones all had some aberration. Some was completely pointless. It didn't matter, like different hair color. Some was important but could be corrected with genetic therapy. But some was just kind of there and not much could be done about it. But some of it was thought to be useful. And that's kind of where we get the experiment here. These and a couple other. Plus, with so many original clone commandos lost at Geonosis and elsewhere, they needed to have the ranks replaced. And where these guys come in. Just as Boss was the sergeant, commander, and kind of most well-rounded member of his pod, Hunter here was the most standard, well-rounded member and commander of his, also ranking at sergeant. He carried the DC-17M. He also carried a DC-17 pistol, had a standard pack, but had a proficiency with bladed weapons, throwing knives, so he carried at least one vibro blade, kind of replacing the gauntlet area on the standard Catan armor, which he's still wearing for the most part. Now, during the war, the Catan armor would be updated. The Mark II would appear 4 or 6 months into the war, and it would have increased protection against EMPs to protect the electronics, also better like shrapnel protection. The Mark II would appear a year or two after that and would have yet improved protection, not just against kinetic impacts, but more energy, like laser blast. It could even take more of a direct hit. And at the end of the war, a specialized version of Mark III would appear, which was custom tailored for night fighting. And here we have one of the late style armor sets with the different helmet, enhanced breathing apparatus from the lighter style Catan armor. This was done to help address a couple of the shortcomings of the armor. While it was very good and durable, early on experience showed that it was a little vulnerable in the joints, and the helmets did have a proficiency of flying off. So the new helmet tried to address that. Standard pack here with old Hunter. And again, he was kind of pulled from the standard CT ranks for his interesting genetic aberrations, and was quite the effective, although highly irregular, trooper. Fulfilling the same role as Sev, we have the best clone commando, Crosshair. Again, wearing mostly standard Catan armor, but even more highly modified. He too carried a DC-17 pistol, because his main role was as a true sniper, whereas Sev carried the updated DC-17M with the attachments. He actually carried a true sniper rifle, the 7.73 Fire Puncher, which had very powerful and very long-range abilities. And it even disassembles to stow in the standard Catan backpack, but this, as you can definitely tell, is a much more specialized, efficient weapon. It does have an external scope, and the helmet is modified to interface with it better. It's just more effective than the internal magnification before. Also a shoulder stock, kind of important. He also has a Mandalorian pattern rangefinder, and same type of helmet as Hunter otherwise. And then he has a long range comms antenna and extra rounds for his rather specialized gun on his armor there. Yeah, they went from a one-size-fits-all kind of customizing a standard trooper type of DMR to a true sniper rifle expert marksman. Part of it was training, part of it was kind of his accidental genetics, but either way, yeah, one of the best shots in the entire Grand Army of the Republic, and afterwards, the Empire. Because Crosshair would actually stay loyal, at least for a minute, till he meets Scorch. Yeah, you think they get on great. Not so much. Figure's pretty neat too, if I can get him to stand straight. A lot of weird weight on this one. Next we come to Fixer's replacement, Dick. And this shows further specialization. In fact, he's wearing more armor reminiscent of Scout Trooper armor. Essentially, it's the Catan armor with plates removed for Yeah, I was just wondering when he would take a tumble. Let's try using the rifle as kind of a tripod and see how that goes. Anyway, back to Teak. I actually think this is a pretty neat look here. He has adaptations to be a tech specialist, and he seems to be more of a mechanic than Fixer was. Still definitely a very good slicer, but also gets his hands dirty a little more. In fact, he doesn't even carry a DC-17M. He actually just carries a blaster pistol, DC-17 for defense. Of course, these are quite potent little guns, but he's got all kinds of pouches, tools, data pads. His backpack is specialized for data. Helmet, of course, has additional comms arrays, goggles, and is its own thing. He may have the most unique kit, but it serves him well. But it also shows, just like with Crosshair there, even more specialization with the clone commandos here versus the originals. And that should increase their ability, even if it does mean they need to watch each other's backs and even work as a team more. Luckily, they've got this thing to kind of watch their backs. Of course, I'm talking about Recker. Kind of Scorch's replacement or analog, but not really. Whereas Scorch liked blowing things up, and this guy was more about brute force and strength and big guns. In fact, they scaled up the DC-17M just for him. Essentially, it's a blaster cannon now. This would look ridiculous in anyone else's hands, but it works for him. He also carries a big knife, kind of like Hunter, but bigger. And has oversized armor based on the Kataran, but a little more like Phase 2. And kind of same goes for the backpack. He's just the heavy weapons guy, the heavy lifter, the physical guy, leaning into that strength. All commandos were trained in hand-to-hand combat, and as I said earlier, they all had vibro blades in their gauntlets. Well, this takes that to the extreme. Still technically a clone of Jango Fett. Yeah, you don't get much more different than this, frankly. And I know some would probably prefer that the deltas over here were built on the buck of Recker, because they wanted to be big and bulky, but I'm going to be honest, I'm glad they kind of built them on the Hunter Crosshair, because otherwise they just look kind of silly. Reminds me of like 90s era action figures when everything had to be huge and bulky. Good news is he stands on his own really well. So that is Clone Force 99. And just as with Delta, maybe even more so, while they worked very well as a unit, a group, they did not always integrate well and play nicely with the standard clone troopers. And that also meant when the Republic turned into the Empire, there was a division. With Delta, while they did very well during the Clone Wars, during one of their last battles, they lost Sev on Kashyyyk, and the other three would join the Empire, but Scorch, who had kind of been the Joker, would seem to become the most Imperial fan, patriotic. In fact, he would end up training the TK troopers, one of those guys. Whereas 99 over here would all, we don't really want to do the Imperial thing, except for Crosshair. He would not only train the TKs, he would essentially lead them and kind of be their commander, at least for a time, until he kind of met Scorch and things didn't go so well. And that's because they were meant to be loyal to each other more than the main army, and also they were trained to be more independent than the regular clones, and this led to independent thinking. It's just, there's pros and cons. They didn't always do things by the book, either team, but they got the job done. To certain generals, that was great. To others, it was irksome. But that's the clone commandos. Arguably the most elite force that the Kaminoans turned out. arguably. But there is one other force that some consider more specialized, more capable, more elite, while others say, no, these guys beat them. So in our final video, well, you know what we're going to talk about, but that's next time.